Lisa, you were inside the courtroom, as I said, very high stakes here. Give us a sense of the tone and your big takeaways.
Well, Judge Tanya Chutkan, Chris, is consummately prepared and incredibly professional. She knew exactly what she needed to accomplish today and went through where we've been in this case, what was left on the table when it was stayed for the former president's immunity appeal, and then what needs to be scheduled now. And she was primarily concerned with two things: scheduling, briefing on presidential immunity, and then other motions that would be pretrial motions, recognizing that this case will likely go to the Supreme Court and back again before it's tried before her. That's why she did not even attempt to set a trial date today. Later today, we should get a scheduling order from her about the immunity issue, though, particularly. And former President Trump's lawyers had one objective today. That was to push that immunity briefing sometime after the election, because if Jack Smith has his way, that immunity briefing is going to include laying out a bunch of the evidence that supports their indictment, including things that aren't ever mentioned in the indictment itself. And they detailed for the court how they might attach things like grand jury interview transcripts, FBI 302 memos. Those are memoranda that reflect interviews that they conduct with witnesses early in the investigation, and other evidence, most of which at this point, according to Trump's lawyers, remains under seal. And so what Judge Chutkan needs to decide now is who is going to brief the issue first. And on that, it appears that Jack Smith and his team are likely to win, that as soon as 3 weeks from today, they could be submitting a brief that defends their superseding indictment as compliant with the Supreme Court's immunity decision, and also tells Judge Chutkan all of the evidence that they're relying upon, both for the indictment itself and perhaps that they would rely upon at trial or did rely upon at the grand jury. They are willing to do that at this point and lay all their cards on the table because their number one objective, as compared with the Trump people, is to have only one appeal of these issues before a trial date can be set, Chris.
All right, so this is a lot of complicated legal stuff, right? This is not guilty or innocent. This is not the details of the case. So let's make sure we understand what Judge Chutkan is talking about here. She knows this is going to end up probably before the Supreme Court. Yes. This trial is not going to start in the next 2 months before the election. So let's start there. But she wants to figure out, first and foremost, correct me if I'm wrong, with this scheduling order, how does this immunity ruling by the Supreme Court apply, not apply, and what that means for the trial?
Exactly, because that's the threshold question. If Donald Trump is immune, like, let's just stop now.
Yeah,
so she has to see if the superseding indictment conforms with the Supreme Court decision. That's the first. And as Lisa said, she knows this is going to the District Court of Appeal. I mean, the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court. So there's not going to be a trial anytime soon. And of course, if Mr. Trump is reelected, there will never be a trial. But assuming that he's not, there will eventually be a trial, but that will be next year.
Okay, so Lisa, let me go back to reminding viewers about the charges against Trump that we're talking about this case. They are all related to his actions on and around January 6th. It's conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. With all of that, Mike Pence's role on January 6th is a major part of what prosecutors hope to present. How do they see his role here? What are they likely to argue?
Chris, what they're likely to argue is that the parts of the indictment that remain as they pertain to Mike Pence aren't really about him acting as vice president per se. As vice president, he would be, as the Supreme Court noted in its opinion, one of Donald Trump's closest advisors. But they are arguing that Mike Pence, at least with respect to the allegations in the indictment, wasn't behaving in that capacity. He was either behaving as Donald Trump's co-candidate or he was behaving as president of the Senate. A conversation between the president of the Senate and the former president of the United States isn't one for which there would be any immunity because the president of the Senate isn't an executive branch official. That's the argument they're going to be making. Now, Trump's lawyers want Judge Chutkan to believe that the Pence allegations are such a substantial portion of the indictment that if she gets rid of those, that the entire indictment has to fall. That is unlikely to be true. Judge Chutkan called them on that today. The special counsel's office was more reserved, but you can see that before we get to the Pence allegations in the indictment, there are pages and pages pertaining to other conduct, including the effort to convince state officials that they should overthrow the certified slates of electors and replace them with Trump electors. And then, of course, that fake elector scheme by which Trump electors met of their own volition and then tried to submit their paperwork to Congress, Chris.
So, Catherine, the judge is also letting Trump's team file its motion. They want Jack Smith off this case altogether. So what's going to be key as she considers that decision?
Well, Judge Chutkan is not Judge Cannon. So she didn't say, of course, I'm going to deny it. She has said, rightly so, that the precedent in the District Court of Appeals and the United States Supreme Court is against them on an argument. Justice Cannon did not agree with that. She's wrong, I would say. But they were going to file that, and it will be denied, and then they will appeal it, which will be to the same district. Delay. But she didn't buy that argument before, and she certainly isn't going to agree with Justice Cannon on this issue.
All right, Vaughn, Donald Trump was not in court today. He was in New York here at a campaign event, right? But it's, again, this split screen, right, between his legal life and his political life. Have we heard from him today? Have we heard anything about this court proceeding from him or his team?
Right, we're actually just a couple blocks from 30 Rock right now, Chris. And for the last hour, he's been speaking to the Economic Club of New York here. A lot of top CEOs, former administration and cabinet officials. And for the better part of the hour, he's been talking about economic tangential issues. But sort of in classic Donald Trump form, it did not go without noting, of course, the prosecutions and the indictments that he continues to face. I want to let you hear directly from him because he did directly to this crowd here of executives reference the federal indictments that he's facing, and then, as you'll hear, a direct shot at how he could potentially use the Department of Justice in his second term beginning next year. Take a listen.
She and her party are censoring speech, weaponizing the justice system, and trying to throw their political opponents, me, in jail. This hasn't happened. I didn't do that to Crooked Hillary. I said that would be a terrible thing, wouldn't it? Putting the wife of the President of the United States in jail. But they view it differently, I guess, nowadays, but that's okay. And they always have to remember that two can play the game. Do things
that two can play the game. Those are the words of Donald Trump here 2 months before the election. And of course, this comes after social media post here over the last week in which he posted the suggestion that potentially some of his perceived rivals, from Barack Obama to Joe Biden to Kamala Harris to Bill Gates to Liz Cheney, could be imprisoned. Of course, the Department of Justice under Donald Trump in his second term could very well look differently. He could direct his acting attorney general or attorney general, one confirmed by the Senate, to potentially seek indictments against some of these top Democratic officials, Chris.
Thank you so much for that, Vaughn. So, Tara, two can play the game. That is the kind of statement, some might say threat, that Donald Trump's base likes. They like that, in their view, he is tough. They like that he goes after his perceived enemies. In fact, Trump has raised a lot of money, as you know, around these cases. He sold merch with his mugshot and the word felon on it after he was convicted in a different case in New York. But as you look to the dwindling number of days between now and the election and the fact that people are going to start voting within a matter of days, ballots are going into the mail, does this help him?
No, it doesn't. And he's got to realize that he's running in a general election. His base is not enough to elect him to the presidency again. And his campaign knows this, but they can't control him. And we've seen the reports over the last few weeks of how undisciplined and how out of control he is, and that Trump knows better than everyone else. That's always how he portrays himself, including even with his own legal strategy. He doesn't listen. He's intransigent. So these types of menacing, threatening comments and the disgusting display of misogyny that he's been putting on his social media, and same thing with his vice presidential partner there, J.D. Vance. This does not help him with moderate voters in the battleground states. That's where this election is going to be won. It's not going to be won with Trump MAGA base people in Texas or Idaho. This is going to be won in 4 to 7 states where people are not they don't respond to this. He has a ceiling, and it looks as though he's reached that ceiling. And that's why Kamala Harris's numbers have been so good. That's why he has not been able to land a political punch on her. This does not resonate with the voters that Donald Trump needs to get him elected. So it'll be very curious to see come Tuesday in the debate if this is the tact that he's going to take. I don't think it works. Even on the economy, he's speaking about the economy today. Goldman Sachs came out and said recently that a Kamala Harris win would be the biggest boost to the U.S. economy that we've had in recent years, better than Donald Trump if he were to get elected. That goes counter to what the Donald Trump campaign thinks that they have as an advantage on the issue of the economy. So if he can't stay on message for them, what he thinks is, what they think, his campaign thinks is a winning issue for him, and he continues with the personal insults and with the like I said, the menacing, that does not bode well for him. The momentum is with Kamala Harris, and you'll see the contrast on Tuesday.